Live from the Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officers podcast studio, where the vessel's its own best instrument of stability and trim. Welcome. This is William George. Okay, this is podcast number 23. We're still in chapter 10, longitudinal hull strength. This should be the last podcast in the series on chapter 10. We are starting at page 245, Recommendations for Loading Bulk Carriers. Bureau Veritas is a society, the purpose of whose maritime division is the classification of vessels, sea and river units, offshore structures, and crafts of all kinds. Bureau Veritas, similar to ABS, the American Bureau of Shipping, is a classification society that sets forth and develops rules, guidance notes, and other documents. Bureau Veritas also participates in the application of national and international regulations or standards, in particular by delegating from different governments. In March of 1995, Bureau Veritas published recommendations to avoid overloading bulk carrier structures. The following has been paraphrased to help complete this chapter on longitudinal hull strength. During the loading and unloading of operations of a bulk carrier, there are possibility to load or unload the ship incorrectly and to produce possibly dangerous situations for the structure of the ship. In the extreme cases, the ship can break into either port or at sea due to faulty loading. The purpose of these recommendations is to analyze these problems to make the concerned person better aware of the consequences of a faulty loading and underline the precautions to be followed to ensure safe loading. Concerned persons are not only the shipmaster and officers, but also the stevedores, ship loaders, port authorities, loading terminals authorities, commercial and technical personnel of shipping companies, owners, and so on. Influences of the error in loading. An error of 10% on the weight of the center of a hull distribution without trim in the extreme holds may produce an increased still water bending moment of 32% of the allowed value, an increase of still water shear force of 24% of the allowed value. An error in the position of the cargo center of gravity in two holds by 5% of the hold length and towards the opposite directions, which leaves the trim nearly the same, may produce an increase of still water bending moment of 15% of the allowed value. These errors may accumulate, and this may produce an total error of 47% of the allowable value. Loading manual. All bulk carriers are supplied with a loading manual approved by the Classification Society. If there is no loading manual on board, or should the information as listed above be missing, the owner has to obtain this information urgently from the shipyard or the Classification Society and make sure the information is approved by the Classification Society. The manual should contain the following information. Maximum draft. This maximum draft is limited by the freeboard marks for the summer, winter, North Atlantic, or the tropical conditions. Masters may be liable for severe penalties by port authorities for contravention to the freeboard draft limitations. When the loading condition produces a sagging deflection of the ship, the total loaded cargo is to be reduced to take into account this sagging deformation to avoid submergence of the freeboard mark. Maximum allowable weights in each individual hold. Maximum allowable weights are to be clearly specified in the manual. These limitations are applicable irrespective of cargo trimming. Some oars are currently loaded with limited trimming. Scantlings of the double bottom are calculated to take into account partial lack of trimming. However, it is always required to have the cargo trimmed at least by moving the nozzle of the cargo loader fore and aft and port and starboard or left and right. Complete trimming may be mandatory for some cargoes liable to shift or liquefy. Maximum level of water in some holds. These holds may be partly filled in port to reduce the air draft. They are not ballast holds but must not contain water at sea. Maximum allowable still water bending moments and maximum allowable still water shear forces. Different limitations are given for each sea voyage condition and for harbor conditions. Also, generally are different for hogging and sagging conditions. Similarly, they are generally different for positive and negative shear forces. Finally, the allowable values are given by 8 curves or 8 listed values as follows. For a voyage at sea in the sagging condition, for a voyage at sea in the hogging condition, for a voyage at sea with a positive shear force, for a voyage at sea with a negative shear force, in harbor sagging, in harbor hogging, in harbor positive shear force, in harbor negative shear force. During loading and unloading, the relevant limitations are in harbor conditions except for the arrival and departure loading conditions, for which the sea voyage conditions are relevant. These limitations are based on scantlings of the ship and are to have been approved by the Classification Society. Loading conditions for the ship have been approved. These series of loading conditions give standard loading cases for voyages with ballast or with cargo. The shear water bending moments and shear water shear force curves for loading conditions are generally calculated for departure and arrival conditions. Other loading conditions are acceptable as far as they satisfy the limitations of the loading manual. This means that all intermediate conditions for the beginning to the end of the loading and unloading sequence are to be within these allowable limits. Minimum draft in way of a hull being loaded with cargo. It is not acceptable to completely load one hold when the others are empty, even if the bending moments and shear force remain acceptable. Indeed, such loading may damage the double bottom of the ship, which may bear too much pressure from one side without enough counter pressure from the sea underneath. Preventing such overloading is normally achieved with at least 3 pours per hold, with the greatest pour limited to 55% of the maximum weight allowed in the hull. Pour limitations. Some of the limitations are specific in port, such as the maximum depth of the water depending on the tide, the maximum air draft under the ship loader, the maximum outreach of the ship loader or unloader, the loading or discharging rate, the load remaining on the conveyor belt to be shipped after the stop signal has been given. Usually from loading grain, it's about 2 minutes to shut down the loader when you get near the full load condition to stop and check your drafts. Voyage limitations. For some voyages, there may be a draft limitation, for example, the depth of the water in some straits, or port limitations. Loading instrument. For most ore carriers and bulk carriers, a loading instrument is made compulsory by the class society. This loading instrument is actually a loading computer in this day and age. This loading instrument is to be approved by the class society. It must be supplemental to and with calibration tests. Its maintenance is to be checked during regular inspections by the class surveyor. When not compulsory for some ships, the loading instrument is to be replaced by a loading booklet containing all the information useful to calculate the draft's bending moment and shear force. However, if not compulsory for some ships, the loading instrument is strongly recommended. Ship's crews is trained in the use of this instrument and become very conversant with it. For any loading condition and with a given water density, the loading instrument calculates the following results: the draft at midships perpendicular, the draft at the after perpendicular, the draft at the forward perpendicular, the bending moment curve along the length of the ship, and the shear force curve is generally included with the shear force correction. Often, instead of curves, the loading instrument gives numeric results at each transverse bulkhead and at the middle of each hold. Comparison of these results with the allowable values at the same position should be made. Precautions to avoid inadvertent loading. The following discussion, several precautions are to take consideration when loading and preparing a sequence of loading following complete loading sequence: trimming, block loading, unloading, damaging the structure using unloading tools such as bulldozers in the hold or clamshell grabs. Preparation of the sequence of loading pour by pour. The master has to prepare a list of all intermediate loading start from the ballast condition when mooring the vessel alongside the quay and ending with a full load departure condition, taking into account the cargo loading rate given by the stevedore and ballasting flow rate, duration of each pour, and the quantity of ballast at the end of each pour is determined by the master. A convenient trim by the stern is to be maintained to achieve quick deballasting. For each step, the master determines the drafts at the aft, midships, and forward perpendiculars respectively, and subsequent air drafts. Then the master calculates the bending moment and shear force curves and checks that all values satisfy the limitations. Loading sequence is to be planned as far as possible, keeping each value of bending moment and shear force and weight in the holds trim as far as allowable limits, and in order that should deviations occur, these limits are not exceeded. Thus, the master has a list of pours ready to be given to the stevedore at the beginning of the loading of cargo. Normally, the list of pours is agreed between the master and the stevedore several days before the arrival of the ship in port. And boy, that would be nice, but I've never really seen that done. They usually wait till the vessel comes alongside, then they argue about it. If it happens sometimes that the proposed loading sequence cannot be accepted by the stevedore for any reason, a new modified complete sequence is prepared again and rechecked to verify this satisfies all limits. General precautions to follow the complete loading sequence. The weighing equipment ashore is to be accurate and reliable as far as possible duplicated. The equipment must be enabled to know accurately not only the total cargo loaded, but also accurately the weight of each pour hold by hold. If the weighted equipment cannot be, such supplementary draft surveys are to be made to obtain these results. Contemplated loading pours are to be followed exactly. Every pour weight is to be recorded in writing together with the time of the pour ended. All items constituting the loading of the ship are under continuous watch. Any unexpected event is to be reacted to immediately. For example, stop ballast pumps unavailable of the ship loader, excess cargo load poured in a hole, abnormal trim, list, etc. Eventually, a new end of the loading sequence is to be rebuilt. If the loading rate is too quick for deballasting rate to follow, it sometimes interrupts the loading may be definitely necessary. So you have to stop loading and wait for the ballast to be pumped off. Trimming. As already indicated, the trimming of the cargo must be at least partially obtained by moving the ship loading nozzle forward and aft, port and starboard, or left and right as you look at it. It's important that At the end of each pour, the center of gravity of the cargo in the hull